Hi, everybody, and welcome to today's episode of the Mad Studies podcast for Disability Pride Week, your podcast for breaking down stigma and bringing the voices of disability studies right to you. I'm your host, Winston Linkwister, and today our guest wishes to remain anonymous. Now, as some of our viewers may be able to tell, this episode is of a little bit of a different format. It's audio only. Now, our guest is an assistant professor whose research focuses on the memoirs of women with mental illness. Also, she teaches courses pertaining to disability studies. So, with that, let's get started. Thank you for agreeing to come on our podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm good. How are you?
Pretty good. Pretty good. So, I guess first and foremost, kind of the elephant in the room. Why do you feel that you must be anonymous, or that you can't disclose your identity when discussing your mental illness?
Because the school where I teach, there's not much in the way of accessibility for students, or accommodations in some ways, although legally some accommodations do have to be given. Not all faculty are happy about doing that and fight that to some extent. So there's not a lot of accessibility in terms of physical accessibility, cognitive, sensory, whatever it may be. And I've actually heard faculty make jokes about someone behaving in a bipolar way. They throw things like that around. And since I don't have tenure, I just get a little nervous about the possibility of disclosing.
I understand. Is it based around a fear of stigma or uh, just the question of tenure?
So that's a good question. Um, I think it's a combination of those things. The stigma that people put on mental illness, this idea that someone with bipolar disorder is unpredictable, um, they behave in extreme ways, they're not capable of doing their job, they're not capable of managing students or a classroom, things like that. So there is stigma associated with it. And if somebody believed I couldn't do those things and had power in terms of deciding tenure, they might decide that I shouldn't be there teaching.
So, do you actually feel that your diagnosis would impact your work at all, or is it just something projected onto you from others?
I don't believe it affects my work in terms of my ability to teach, to grade, to work with students, to do research. So the nuts and bolts of it, I don't think it has any effect on that. In terms of what I want to teach, what I want to research, it has an effect on that, but not in terms of ability. It doesn't have an effect.
Um, is Have you encountered this sort of problem before in your life, outside of an academic setting with any employer?
I have not. When I was diagnosed, I actually worked for a family company and then shortly thereafter started graduate school. And in graduate school, I was pretty open about it. Um, it was part of why I wanted to study the topics I studied, wanted to write about the things I did for my various classes, why I wanted to teach the classes I did as a graduate teacher. So I was pretty open about it. Um, and then and I thought I would be open about it when I got a job, quite honestly. I really thought I would. And then the reality hits you when you get a full-time job after graduate school of, oh my gosh, I have to get tenure. So I want to make sure I do the right things so that I get tenure and have a job. Um, so in terms of that, there are a lot of things that I think people hold back on. Maybe we don't teach things that are as controversial as we might once we have tenure. Um, Maybe some people, this is not what I do, but I know some people don't grade as hard because they want good teaching evaluations. Um, so I think there's that, like this sudden, oh my gosh, I'm in this place where I have not responsibility, that's not quite the right word, but there's so much writing on getting tenure that suddenly the idea of just a few people thinking this person's not right in the head, so we shouldn't keep them, is enough for me to feel like I can't let people know.
That's really terrible, honestly. Um, so, can you kind of expand on that on the difference of experience between you when you were a student, like an undergrad and grad student who is able to be more open about your diagnosis of mental illness compared to as an employee? Like, what's the
Yeah.
difference in experience been for it?
Um, so graduate school, I was at public university, um, mostly a commuter school, very diverse. So there was a lot of that. The school I'm at now is not that kind of demographic. So part of it was when I came in to the program. Well, originally I thought I was going to study representations of women in 20th century drama. I didn't end up going that direction, but I ended up studying rhetoric and composition and the way women represent themselves in memoirs and narratives in insane asylums in the 19th century and then in psychiatric practices in the 20th century and 21st. So I think I felt like I'm just going to put it all out there. People wanted to know, and this was really before I had any knowledge of disability studies as a field. So I knew nothing about that. I sort of was coming at it from more of a medical humanities perspective in some ways. And I thought that might be the direction I went. And then found at a conference, the Conference on College Composition and Communication, that's held every year, I found panels on disability studies and realized that's what I wanted to work with. And there was so much sort of personal sort of research that went into what some of these people were doing. And that was just something that I felt like was important in what I was doing at the time in graduate school. And I gave presentations at conferences that talked very openly about my own diagnosis, my own experience. So, and I really felt like it was important for students to not sort of believe in the stigma, to not buy into the stigma of mental illness. And I taught a lot of classes around rhetoric of mental illness in graduate school and was fairly open with my students about it. I didn't announce it, but if students came to me and wanted to talk, I would disclose to them. In one class, I actually did completely disclose. It was representations of women in mental illness in the 20th century. And my best friend, and this may get too heavy, but my best friend was battling depression, and she lost the battle and died by suicide. And it happened mid-semester, and I felt like I had to address that with my students. So I did tell them. I talked to them about her. I talked to them about me. Said I was going to be gone for a week, and it was pretty remarkable. Almost every single student in that class came up to me at the end of class and said they had a friend who had died by suicide or someone in their family. I had a student then later in the semester write that she had thought about suicide. And it changed the way our class worked as a community, even though it was a great class beforehand and everyone got along and we talked openly. It was just a different class after that. It was so much closer. So I think that was part of it too. Having gone through that affected my wanting people to know. And then again, this notion of I want a job and I want tenure. And the school where I teach is a very different kind of school. It's much more conservative. It's not diverse. I think I thought I would. I definitely thought I would. Because I thought, so much of what I've done in terms of conference presentations and working with my students has been about being open, not hiding disability, not hiding mental illness, getting rid of stigma. And then suddenly I'm in this place where I feel like I can't do that. So that's the long-winded answer to your question.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for sharing it again. Sorry for your loss. Um, So it sounds like this degree of openness actually, it almost sounds like it would help with breaking down those stigmas and breaking down those relationships. Or, sorry, not breaking down those relationships, creating the relationships that we need to have a better understanding for disability studies and those who are diagnosed with disabilities. What can you say about the openness and that idea of, or that almost feeling of community when it comes to uh, treating or discussing disabilities?
Uh, so I think that this sense of community that develops when people disclose having a mental illness, if you feel alone, which I think a lot of people do for any number of reasons, um, suddenly it's like, oh my gosh, someone gets it. Wait, this person understands. This person deals with this kind of thing. You found, for lack of a better word, like a kindred spirit, um, I think is what happens. And as much as I would like to build that kind of community more often in my classrooms, um, it is this fear of not having a job, which on the one hand is kind of ridiculous, on the other hand is pretty practical. I have had students notice things, necklaces that I've worn that sort of directly relate to mental illness. And I've had students come up to me and ask questions about, so what is that necklace? What's on it? What does this mean? And I've told them, and then they've said, oh my gosh, I have a sister who has depression, or I have an uncle who deals with this. And I'm like, if you ever want to talk about that, if that's something that is difficult for you, or, whatever, I'm certainly welcome to talk with you about it. I'm in my office and I'm available. And students always say thank you. They appreciate that. Um, so it does sort of build a bond with people because I think people feel like they can't always share that, for fear of people saying, oh, you have a crazy uncle, or, oh, um, you know, your little sister can't deal with life and that's so weak, or whatever it may be. So I think that finding people who understand that that's not what it is incredibly helpful. I know that. So my Facebook, which I don't connect to people at work with my Facebook, students, faculty, staff, anyone. And I do post a lot on there about awareness of mental illness, about neurodiversity, about breaking down stigma. And some of my friends on Facebook are totally aware of my diagnosis, and some of my friends on Facebook are not. But they're all aware of things that I think this is very important in our society. They are aware of that, and I don't have a problem with that. Like, that doesn't bother me. Certainly, one of them could probably call up my school and say, "Oh, by the way, did you know
Hmm.
you have this professor who posts all this stuff?" And but at some point you have to say, I am going to live my life and I'm going to do the things that make me feel like I'm making a difference. And unfortunately, I'm not making as much of a difference at work as I wish I could.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Um, and what about that degree of openness to people who say don't necessarily relate to being diagnosed with a mental disability? Do you think openness could help in bridging kind of a gap to them in understanding and reducing stigma?
Oh, I think absolutely. I remember um, when I was a graduate student and I was teaching a class that dealt with Western, it was like representations of mental illness in like Western culture, I think is what it was. And I actually, the nurse practitioner who I worked with in my psychiatrist's office, so actually my nurse practitioner came in and did a presentation in class about the way, like brain images and brain scans, and showing how they look when somebody's having um, like a manic episode, or like all these different things, like all these brain scans. And when she came in, she said, how many of you have or know somebody with a mental illness. And probably half the class raised their hand. And she said, most of you, in fact, I think she said all of you actually probably know somebody, but they may not have let you know. And this one student kept saying, no, I would know. I would know. Like, there's definitely no one. No, there's no one. And it was clear, like, he felt like mental illness was something that was bad. I mean, that was obvious. And by the end of the class, he didn't have that perspective anymore. And I think that's something that was pretty important, that the student was able to go from this place of, this is a bad thing, so clearly no one I associate with would have it, to this is part of the human experience and it's okay. So I think it definitely does break down the stigma. Absolutely, it does. And I think people who, especially people who are in like the public, the public light, who step out and say, hey, I battle depression, or I have an eating disorder, I have anxiety. People who come out and say that, I think it's amazing. It does make a difference. It helps people who don't want to come out about it, who don't want to get help. It definitely makes a difference, I think, in doing that. So I have a lot of admiration for people who do. People I know who are academics who've written articles about their experiences, who've written whole books about their experiences with mental illness in the academic world. I just think that's amazing. And maybe one day I'll feel comfortable doing that kind of thing. And hopefully that will help in terms of my own students feeling comfortable, breaking down stigma at the school, all those kinds of things.
So, just how would you say that your school, or not just your school, but any school in particular, could work to kind of reduce that rhetoric and break down that stigma to be more accessible and be more open about disabilities, whether they be mental or physical or anything really?
Well, I think there are several ways schools can do it. I think through disability services offices. I think having services available, both in terms of accommodations and accessibility for students, as well as for staff and faculty, and what they need, is important. And making that well known to everybody, having a strong presence on the campus. There's some schools whose disability services offices I've looked at, and they actually have a calendar sort of events on their website, and they give workshops where faculty can come and learn about, disabilities, and learn about how to make the classroom more accessible, and learn about how to make your whatever learning platform you use, how to make that more accessible. And I think that is excellent, absolutely excellent. I love that there are places that are doing those kinds of things. In addition, wait, go back. Tell me the question again. Now I'm confused by what I just said. I'm sorry.
No, you're fine. It's just what can schools do to improve the environment to be more accessible and with reduced stigma?
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Yep.
I also think that in teaching awareness of it and teaching it as a topic, for example, I'm co-teaching a class with someone who teaches in our education department. And this professor teaches special education classes. He is very devoted to helping students recognize that any type of disability is part of the human experience. And he talks a lot about the first line of IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And that's what it says, that disability is a natural part of the human experience. And I have students that he has had, both in the class we're co-teaching, as well as in my composition classes that are focused on disability studies. And students can say the first line of that, the first sentence in the IDEA, verbatim if they have had him in class. And they fully believe that, you know what, disabilities are, you know, whatever. If I lived in a different society, I mean, I wear contacts and eyeglasses in a different society, that could be a huge disability. But the society we're in, I can have contacts and eyeglasses. So it's not the same. And they're amazing. Like those students who have had classes with him definitely have a more open understanding of neurodiversity. Um, uh, what else? Of understanding accommodations and accessibility and how important that is and how valuable that is for students. So I think in anyone teaching those kinds of topics and subjects, I think that can go a long way to helping the stigma around mental illness, around disability, around people feeling uncomfortable around people with disabilities, not knowing how to talk about disabilities, those kinds of things. I think when we teach about the subject, when we share stories from people with disabilities to our students, that definitely makes a difference.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And sorry, before we get too far along, do you mind describing your mental illness diagnosis, if you don't mind? If not, that's
Oh,
totally okay.
no, I'm totally fine with it. So I have bipolar disorder, and I have ADD, and I have anxiety. Um, in terms of my bipolar disorder, I do take medication, so that's what works for me. I take it religiously because I know if I don't, my life will quickly spin out of control. So I'm aware for me that's what I need to live a productive life. Uh, let's see. In terms of how my bipolar sort of moods work is I tend to anger easily. So it's like it's rapid cycling. So instead of like really high highs and low lows, which I can have, I tend to just have highs and lows all throughout the day, which are managed a lot by my medication. I interrupt people a lot because once my mind gets going, it's like I've got to say it kind of a thing. So I'm much more conscientious about that than I used to be because I know it's part of being bipolar. I have a shopping therapy issue. So they recently changed one of my medications so that maybe I wouldn't be quite as depressed as I'd been for a while. And I started spending more money than I should have been spending, and have started to recognize that. So I'm trying not to do that, but that is definitely how it manifests itself. Unfortunately, I am no longer in manic states where I get lots of work accomplished, which is kind of a bummer because I am pretty productive when when I become manic or hypomanic, perhaps, not full blown manic. And I don't have that right now, so I do procrastinate a lot, to be honest. So there's a plus sometimes to being hypomanic or a little bit manic, which I miss. Um, my anxiety doesn't manifest itself too terribly often, happily. It's things like being on a plane, being in a car with somebody else driving, things like that is when I have problems with anxiety. And my ADD is, even though I take medication for it, like I constantly click my pens, I fidget with things. So that's kind of, I mean, and yeah, like if somebody says, oh, hey, and they're in a conversation with me, if I'm in this is the best way to say it. If I'm in a conversation with somebody and it's not the most interesting conversation, and I hear somebody like in a coffee shop across the room talking about something, and I hear somebody on the other side of me talking about something, like the conversation I'm having is gone. It's completely gone because I'm now listening or trying to listen to like 3 different conversations. So my daughter likes to point out when I'm being ADD in social situations. She finds that kind of amusing. I mean, she points it out just to me. She doesn't announce, hey, look at my mom, she has ADD. Likes to point out to me, hey, what's up, ADD? Stop doing that. So yeah, so that's my diagnosis, how it works.
Okay. Again, thank you for sharing. So, one point of debate that often comes up, and I think it's come up with every one of these interviews where one of the interviewees is diagnosed with, say, something like bipolar. Do you hold that diagnosis as part of your identity or as a secondary entity?
That's a good question. I think for me, it's very much a part of my identity. When I was diagnosed, I was an adult when I was diagnosed, and I was in my early 30s. And when the nurse practitioner who did all the testing, and she's a psychiatric nurse practitioner, I should say. So like she's specifically handles psychiatric care. She said, I don't understand, because I'd been diagnosed with depression when I was 21 and misdiagnosed and put on medication. It was a mess. It was a disaster. Stopped taking it and didn't look back, kind of a thing. So when I was diagnosed in my early 30s, and she said, this is a textbook case. You have bipolar disorder. This is just, why they ever thought you had depression, I don't understand. And she said, as far as I can tell, she said, there's no way to go back and say that you had it as a teenager or a kid, because we can't, retroactively diagnose you. She said, but based on what you've told me, you probably did have it fairly early on. And it was like, oh my gosh, that explains it. Like, that explains it. Like, there's not something wrong with me inherently. It's like, no, like my mind just works differently from other people's minds. It's like, yes, thank goodness. It was such a sense of relief to have that diagnosis. So I feel like it is part of who I am, most definitely. And the question of, well, would you, get rid of it if you could? If you could not be bipolar anymore, would you not be bipolar anymore? Are there moments when I'm upset about my life and sad and want to die, although I'm not suicidal, but really feel like life would be better if things would be better if I weren't alive, that kind of notion, which I have sometimes. At that point, would I say, yeah, maybe I don't want to be bipolar, but I also know it's such a huge part of who I am, such a huge part of who I am, such a big part of what I do, how I relate to people. And so I can't imagine what my life would have been like if I hadn't been. I mean, I've made some bad choices, don't get me wrong, probably in large part because of being bipolar and being unmedicated. But I definitely see it as part of that's just me. So yeah, part of my identity.
Mm-hmm. Now, about that question of medication, how do you feel about it? Just how do you feel about the frequent use of medication for treatment of uh, diagnosed mental disabilities and the potential of misdiagnosis and how disastrous that can be?
So for misdiagnosis, I mean, I don't know how they misdiagnosed me looking back. I didn't know anything about mental disability or mental illness. I didn't know anything about medications when I was diagnosed. I mean, I really didn't know anything at all. So arguing about like, no, you're diagnosing me wrong, or, oh, this isn't the right medication, I couldn't have done that. But when I was sleeping 20 hours a day and couldn't function, I realized something's not right about what they're giving me. And at the time I didn't have health insurance, and it was just like, I'm just going to stop taking this and go on about my life. In general, I feel like people have to do what works for them. So I have a friend who lives with depression who Doesn't take medication, doesn't do yoga or meditation or things like that. And we were talking about it because he said, he has some rough days, but he's been medicated so much of his life that he feels like he'd like to try life without medication. And I can understand that. I can totally understand that. Um, for me, it's what works. I'm not judgmental of people who choose not to do that. I think if you are a parent of a minor who has a mental disability or mental illness, you do have a pretty strong obligation to get them the absolute best treatment to meet their needs, even if you don't necessarily agree with it. So there's that. But for adults, people need to do what works for them and what they feel okay doing. Some people know that, yeah, medication works, but I don't like putting that into my body. I was pretty specific when they put me on medication that I wouldn't take anything that would cause me to gain weight. I said, I don't care how good it is, I won't take it. It can take a long time to find the right mix of medication if you're on multiple medications. I was lucky in that it didn't take too terribly long. So I think that therapy is important, having someone to talk to. And I say that being someone right now who's not seeing a therapist, so I recognize the hypocrisy. But I think that's pretty important regardless of whether someone is taking medication or not taking medication. Taking care of themselves with how they eat and how they exercise, or whatever it may be. I do think therapy is pretty important regardless. And I think that's probably true for people with a diagnosed mental disability or not a diagnosed mental disability. It's good to have somebody outside yourself to talk to. So that's my 2 cents.
Okay, thank you. Now, I kind of want to turn this back to you a little bit because we're kind of getting towards the end third of the time slot that we have. So I want to make sure that we touch on the research work that you mentioned. So you mentioned that you do research focusing on the memoirs of women with mental illness. Do you mind telling us a little bit about that?
Okay. It started with looking at 19th century publications and women talking about their experience in insane asylums, and most of them, not all, but most of them claiming they didn't belong in the insane asylum, which I thought was pretty interesting. And I was looking at commitment laws in the 19th century in terms of women, because they were different for women and men. And then I just sort of started reading kind of everything I could in terms of women and them talking about being institutionalized, having mental illness, accepting diagnosis, not accepting diagnosis, feeling like psychiatric institutions are horrible, feeling like they're okay. I kind of all over the place with that. What I'm hoping to do in the next, I don't know, 2-3 years, however long it takes, I'd like to be working on a book, and I've written sort of parts of it that looks at the way that women starting in the 50s, because as early as the 1950s, there were women talking about having a mental illness, being diagnosed with a mental illness, and being in a mental hospital or psychiatric institution, and their experience about it. And in the 50s and 60s, most of these women were like, yeah, I belong here and I'm a horrible person and the doctors know everything, and why can't I be a better person and a better wife, and why am I not a better patient? And they were very what do I want to say? They were really hard on themselves. Basically, they had no worth because they were dealing with this disability. and everybody else had value. So I want to look at the way that the rhetoric has changed over time to what you have more so now in these memoirs that women are writing, where oftentimes they say, hey, yeah, I've got this diagnosis. Yes, I have this. Yes, I need help in some way. Either I need to take medication, or I need to take medication and make sure I exercise regularly. You know, I don't take medication, but this is how I deal with it. But they challenge doctors, and they challenge the institution of psychiatric care. So they're not just going along with what's happening to them. They're not just a bystander in the process. Many of them challenge what's happening, struggle sometimes with what's going on, sometimes saying, I wish I didn't have this. I don't want to tell people about it. In other memoirs, I have this and I don't love it, but the stigma around it is ridiculous, and I'm going to be open about it. And, they need to change the way they care for patients, because I know more about myself than they know about me. Why don't they ever listen to me? So I'd really like to do more analysis of this, the rhetoric, the way these women talk about themselves, talk about psychiatric care, and the history that goes along with that. So why might this have changed? Why might the way these women are talking about themselves and mental illness and care, why has that changed? Because obviously a lot of it has to do with the history of psychiatry. I mean, that's part of it, and how women have been treated as well in society, and a combination of those kinds of things. So that's a lot of what I look at. And I think, in looking at that clearly, there's something about myself that is, sort of drawn to that. And I find helpful to hear people talking about it and disclosing it. There's obviously very much like a personal connection.
Definitely, definitely. Do you feel some of those aspects of like disconnect between the institutions themselves and the patients still exist to this day?
Yeah, I do. There are some crappy doctors and some poor nurses, and I know someone who was in psychiatric hospital, and I'm talking, this is a minor who was there, so it wasn't an adult. But they were aware why they were there. They believed they needed to be there. But the care they received wasn't terribly helpful. There was someone there. So this is pretty awful, in my opinion. This person had a roommate in the hospital who was deaf, and before this young person got there, no one was doing anything to accommodate her disability. Nothing. Like when
Like
they
absolutely nothing.
No, nothing. When they came and woke her up in the morning, they just turned on the light, and that was it. And said time to get up. But obviously she doesn't hear that. And if she didn't notice the light was on, she wouldn't get up, and then she'd get in trouble because she wasn't up and at breakfast. Nobody had brought in an interpreter for her for anything. She just wasn't having sessions with a therapist. So this young person I know who was there asked, basically wrote down on a piece of paper, will you teach me some sign language? Are there things that I could help you with? And in 5 days' time, the two became pretty close. But nobody else, I should say nobody else. I don't know about the other kids who were there, but none of the professionals were doing anything. And I thought that is heartbreaking, as well as incredibly infuriating. These kids just weren't getting the care that they should have been just basic kinds of things.
Yeah, that's terrible, and you'd think that's just, I don't know, common practicality that if she can't hear it, you should accommodate for that. Oh,
Yeah. Yeah, it was ridiculous.
wow. Um, do you feel like that, or the reason why I ask is because a lot a lot of so this podcast does relate to mad studies and that field of knowledge, and a lot of mad studies is, or a big portion of mad studies kind of considers itself almost anti-psychiatry, in the sense that it goes against that degree of um, basically it goes against medical professionals and kind of works in its own right away from that. How do you feel about that and the relationship of medical professionals to their patients and that idea of potential anti-psychiatry?
Right. A lot of harm has been done in the name of psychiatry, certainly. I mean, I think without a doubt, bad things have been done. And people have had treatments that have not been helpful. Um, I feel like I'm lucky in that that hasn't been my experience, although I am on the search for a new psychiatrist. But someone who's my age, a friend from high school, told me that when he goes to see his psychiatrist, he has bipolar disorder. When he goes to see his psychiatrist, his parents go with him. And I said, you know, that legally they have no right to be there. And he said, well, my psychiatrist wants them there. And I said, legally they have no right to be there. And he said, yeah, well, they're there. I go, you can tell them not to be there. And he said, it doesn't matter. My psychiatrist won't talk to me unless they're there. That to me is not, I mean, that's not acceptable. So people who have that kind of experience, I totally get being anti-psychiatry. I completely get that. Um, that just, it hasn't been my experience. So I don't fault people for feeling that way and for not wanting to be part of the medicalized sort of ideas about mental illness. I also very much believe in the idea of neurodiversity, that thinking in different ways is not a bad thing. Um, People, you know, so if you're on the autism spectrum, or you have learning disabilities, or you have anxiety, you have depression, bipolar disorder, whatever it may be, like those are all ways that people exist differently in the world. And that's okay. That's not bad. Um, I know that I couldn't function in the world without medication. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I couldn't. Um, so for me, there is a dependence on psychiatry, um, until maybe someone finds a better way to do things. So yeah, I mean, I totally understand um, where people come from. I get it. Um, and it's just not, it hasn't been my experience, kind of a thing. Uh, it's, you know, it's like people um, on the autism spectrum who have had really bad experiences with treatments, with doctors, with clinicians. I mean, almost to the point of abusive. And I get, you know, being very anti um, sort of medicine, medical practice in terms of that when that's been your experience. It makes sense. I mean, it makes perfect sense. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Now, unfortunately, it looks like we're at the tail end of the amount of time that we have. So, just the final question: are there any areas that you wish that we talked about that you'd like to touch on? Any final messages that you'd like to have for either me or our audience? Um, yeah, basically, the floor is open to you if there's anything else you want to say that we didn't necessarily talk about.
Wow. Well, I mean, I think this is going to be hypocritical. So this is going to be totally hypocritical as somebody who doesn't disclose. Um, I wish that, especially in a college setting, I wish more of my students would tell me about their lives, about things that are going on with them. And some of that directly relates to mental illness and some of it doesn't. But when I have students who end up failing my class or having to drop my class and they don't tell me until it's too late that, oh, by the way, I'm on new meds for depression and that caused me problems. Or I've been, I had to go to see the counselor and I got, upset and I've been cutting and I didn't want to come to class and then I stopped seeing the counselor, whatever it may be, and they don't tell me, and then there's nothing I can do. Like, I can't work with them. I can't make the class more accessible. That makes me sad, that more of my students don't open up about it. But obviously that is hypocritical because I do not disclose. So I understand that, but I feel like in my classes, when I talk so much about accessibility and that I want to help my students succeed, and if I can do things differently to help them with that, just let me know privately and confidentially. And they don't. I feel so bad for them that they're struggling. They don't feel like they have enough people to talk to. They don't feel like they can come out about it to anyone, not just like come out about it like totally publicly, but just like privately to me to help them with their classes. That's something that's really difficult for me to deal with, that I can't help them more. So that's kind of it. I wish students would, more often trust professors who show that they're trustworthy, like me. That's it.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much for that final message. So, with that, thank you again for agreeing to be interviewed and to be on our show.
Oh,
Um,
yeah, pleasure.
yeah. So, all right, everybody. Again, my name is Winston Linquister, and you were just listening to the Mad Studies podcast for Disability Pride Week.